The lights of Manhattan glittered outside the penthouse window, but inside, the sound of torn paper echoed louder than the city. 10-year-old Ethan Miller sat trembling at the dining table, clutching another report card covered in F's. His mother, Victoria Miller, one of the wealthiest women in America, stood over him with icy disappointment in her eyes. "You're a Miller," she hissed, her voice sharp as glass, "and Millers don't fail." But what Victoria didn't know was that her son's salvation wouldn't come from tutors or money. It would come from the quiet, overlooked janitor sweeping the marble floors of her empire. The city of New York glittered every night, but inside the tallest glass tower that bore her name, Miller Global Industries, Victoria Miller lived a life far removed from the warmth of ordinary families. She was a billionaire, a woman who had built an empire from bold deals and relentless ambition. People admired her power, envied her wealth, and feared her sharp tongue in the boardroom. Yet behind the success and designer dresses, her personal life was far more fragile than anyone imagined. Her world was run like a business, efficient, strict, and unbending, even when it came to her only son. Ethan Miller, just 10 years old, lived in the shadow of this empire. His hair was a messy shade of blonde that always seemed to fall into his eyes, and he carried the constant look of a boy lost in thought. His bedroom was filled with the latest gadgets, shelves stacked with books he never touched, and toys that gathered dust in corners. Despite the privilege around him, Ethan felt lonelier than any child should. His mother loved him in her own way, but her affection was buried beneath cold expectations and a constant demand for excellence. Every morning, Ethan was driven to his prestigious private school in a black luxury car, greeted by teachers who already knew his mother's reputation. They expected brilliance, assuming success was in his blood. Instead, Ethan returned home each afternoon with papers marked in red, filled with low scores and discouraging comments. Needs improvement, unfocused, careless mistakes. The words haunted him like shadows. He wanted to make his mother proud, but no matter how hard he tried, failure seemed to follow him. Victoria's home was as polished as her office, marble floors, tall windows, and long dining tables where silence replaced laughter. Dinners were brief, she often ate quickly, scrolling through her phone while Ethan pushed food around his plate. When she did speak, it was usually about school or the tutor she hired and fired in frustration. Ethan rarely looked her in the eye, afraid of seeing disappointment reflected back at him. Their home had everything money could buy, except warmth. Far below Victoria's high-rise office, another world existed. Daniel Carter, age 40, moved quietly through the same skyscraper as its janitor. His hands were rough, his back often sore from years of labor, but his spirit was steady. Daniel was a widower, raising his 9-year-old daughter Lily on his own in a modest apartment across the river in Queens. He wasn't rich, but he was present, walking her to school every morning, helping with homework at night, and teaching her lessons that came not from books, but from the resilience of a man who had survived loss and hardship. Daniel's job was simple but honest, mopping marble floors, emptying trash bins, polishing glass walls that reflected the city's lights. Most executives passed him without notice, treating him like another piece of furniture in the building. But Daniel never minded. He found pride in providing for his daughter and teaching her that dignity didn't come from wealth, but from character. To him, life was about persistence, kindness, and never letting circumstances define your worth. One evening, as Daniel worked his shift, he noticed a boy sitting quietly in the office lobby. The child's small shoulders hunched over, his hands clutching a piece of paper. His face carried a mix of sadness and defeat that Daniel recognized instantly. It was the same look he had worn as a boy when the world seemed stacked against him. The boy was Ethan Miller, though Daniel didn't know it at the time. All he saw was a child who looked like he was carrying the weight of something too heavy. That night marked the beginning of an unlikely crossing of worlds. Ethan, the lonely son of a billionaire, and Daniel, the janitor who had nothing but wisdom and grit, were about to collide. Neither of them knew how much the other would change their life. But fate has a way of placing the right people together at the right time, even in the most unexpected corners of a skyscraper. Ethan sat in his classroom, surrounded by polished desks and children in crisp uniforms. The teacher handed back graded papers, her voice flat as she called out names. When she placed Ethan's exam on his desk, his heart sank. Another glaring red F circled at the top. A ripple of whispers spread across the room, and some kids smirked. Ethan lowered his head, wishing he could disappear beneath the desk. For him, failure wasn't new, but humiliation never got easier. At pickup, the chauffeur silently handed Ethan's report card to Victoria as she stepped out of her car. She glanced at the grades, her jaw tightening, her stilettos clicking angrily against the pavement. "Another F," she muttered coldly. Ethan froze, staring at the ground, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack. "Do you want the world to think my son is incapable?" Her voice cut deeper than the failing grade itself. Ethan didn't answer. Silence was safer than words. That evening, dinner felt like punishment. Victoria placed the report card on the marble table between them, the red marks staring back like wounds. "I've hired the best tutors money can buy," she said sharply, "yet you still bring me this?" Ethan toyed with his fork, his appetite gone. "I tried," he whispered, but his words fell flat against her hardened expression. "Trying isn't enough, Ethan. You're a Miller, and Millers do not fail." The words echoed in his mind long after the plates were cleared. The next day, his tutor quit. She shook her head in frustration as she packed her bag. "He doesn't focus. He's distracted. I can't help a boy who refuses to learn." Victoria sighed, her patience fraying. She turned to Ethan with eyes full of disappointment, not pity. "Do you see what you're doing? Even the best can't teach you." Ethan shrank into his chair, guilt and shame wrapping around him like chains. He wanted to scream that he wasn't lazy, he was lost, but his voice never found the courage. That night, while Victoria stayed late for another meeting, Ethan sat in the office lobby, his report card folded tightly in his hands. The tall glass windows reflected the city lights, but he saw none of it. He opened his sketchbook, drawing a dragon with sharp wings, a creature powerful enough to fight the battles he never could. His eyes stung with unshed tears. "Maybe Mom's right," he thought. "Maybe I'll never be good enough." The dragon's eyes on the page looked fiercer than he felt. As Daniel pushed his mop across the polished floor, he noticed the boy again. This time, Ethan's head was bent low, his hands shaking slightly as he drew. Daniel slowed his pace, studying the child's slumped posture, the way defeat seemed to cling to him. Gently, he spoke. "That's a pretty mean-looking dragon you've got there." Ethan startled, snapping his sketchbook shut. "It's nothing," he muttered. But Daniel crouched down, smiling softly. "Nothing that detailed looks like nothing, kid." For a moment, Ethan hesitated, unsure if he should answer. But something about Daniel's tone felt safe, different from the sharpness of adults he knew. "I draw when I don't want to think about school," Ethan admitted quietly. Daniel nodded slowly, leaning on the handle of his mop. "School giving you trouble, huh?" Ethan bit his lip and whispered, "I'm dumb. I always fail." His voice cracked, the words laced with years of bottled frustration. Saying it out loud hurt more than keeping it inside. Daniel's chest tightened at the boy's confession. He saw himself in Ethan, a child once dismissed as hopeless. "Listen, son," he said softly, his voice steady. "You're not dumb. You just haven't found your way yet. Sometimes it's not about being the smartest, it's about finding the right way to learn." Ethan blinked, surprised to hear something other than criticism. For the first time in a long while, a small flicker of hope stirred inside him. And Daniel, though he didn't know it yet, had just stepped into the most important role of his life. The nights that followed became quiet lessons in the office lobby. Each time Victoria worked late, Ethan slipped down with his sketchbook and homework, waiting for Daniel. They sat on the lobby couch, textbooks spread out like treasure maps. Daniel explained fractions using pizza slices, turned spelling words into games, and made history feel like stories of real people instead of dry dates. Ethan began to smile, small, hesitant smiles at first, but real. For the first time, learning didn't feel like punishment. But at home, Victoria noticed little change. She saw Ethan bent over his papers more often, but she dismissed it as temporary. When she asked about his progress, Ethan hesitated, hiding Daniel's involvement. "Just trying harder," he said quietly. Victoria nodded with skepticism, her sharp eyes scanning him. "Don't fool yourself into thinking small improvements matter. Excellence is all that counts." Her words extinguished the spark in his chest, but Daniel's encouragement lit it again the next evening. At school, Ethan faced a new battle. His classmates noticed his struggles and turned them into jokes. "Hey, billionaire boy, did you buy your F?" one sneered as Ethan walked by. He flushed red, gripping his backpack straps tighter. The whispers followed him down hallways like shadows. Even when he did better, the stigma of failure clung to him. But each insult only drove him back to Daniel, who listened patiently and reminded him, "What they say doesn't define you. What you do next does." Daniel's lessons weren't only about schoolwork. He taught Ethan how to set small goals, how to breathe when panic made numbers blur, how to take mistakes as stepping stones instead of walls. "See this mop?" Daniel said one evening, holding it up. "People think it's just cleaning floors, but every night I move step by step, row by row, until the whole place shines. That's how you tackle big problems, little by little." Ethan's eyes widened, as though a new world was opening before him. Still, progress came with setbacks. One week, Ethan aced a small quiz, and pride glowed on his face. But days later, he failed another test and sank back into despair. "I knew it was just luck," he muttered, tearing the paper in half. Daniel calmly picked up the pieces. "Luck doesn't show up twice, kid. Hard work does. One failure doesn't erase the steps you've climbed." Slowly, Ethan nodded, realizing he had never heard failure described as temporary before. The idea gave him strength. Meanwhile, Victoria grew impatient. Teachers sent notes about Ethan's uneven performance, and she bristled at the inconsistency. She hired yet another expensive tutor, but Ethan couldn't connect with them the way he did with Daniel. The tutor lectured, Daniel listened. The tutor assigned drills, Daniel told stories. Yet Victoria couldn't imagine trusting a janitor over a professional. To her, success had to be bought, structured, proven. And so she pressed Ethan harder, blind to the quiet progress already unfolding. One evening, Ethan arrived in the lobby with red, puffy eyes. "She yelled again," he admitted softly to Daniel, clutching his math book. Daniel's heart ached at the boy's trembling voice. "She doesn't see me. She only sees the F's." Daniel put a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then let's give her something else to see. Not to prove her right or wrong, but to show yourself what you can do." For the first time, Ethan looked up, determination flickering through the tears. The struggle wasn't over, far from it. Ethan still stumbled, still fought against doubt, still faced his mother's icy standards. But with every evening spent in that lobby, he was changing. The boy who once whispered, "I'm dumb," now dared to say, "I'll try again." It was a fragile seed of resilience, nurtured by Daniel's patience and belief. And though neither of them knew it yet, the strength Ethan was building would soon be tested in a way that would shake their world. One crisp evening, Victoria returned from her meeting earlier than usual. As the glass doors of the lobby slid open, she froze at the sight before her. There was Ethan, sitting cross-legged on the couch, books spread around him. Beside him, in his janitor's uniform, was Daniel Carter, patiently explaining a math problem. Ethan's laughter rang out, light and free, a sound Victoria hadn't heard in months. But instead of warmth, she felt anger rise like fire in her chest. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she approached, her presence immediately silencing the scene. Ethan's face paled, his smile vanishing as quickly as it came. Daniel stood up respectfully, sensing the storm in her eyes. "Ethan," Victoria's voice was ice, "what exactly is going on here?" The boy fumbled with his books, stammering, I was just..." But Victoria cut him off, her gaze fixed on Daniel. "You're the janitor," she said flatly, her words laced with disdain. "Why are you sitting with my son as if you're his teacher?" Daniel held her stare calmly, his voice steady. "I was helping him, ma'am. He just needed a different approach." Victoria scoffed, folding her arms. "I pay professionals, not cleaners, to educate him. Stay away from my son." The words hit like a gavel striking down a sentence. Ethan's heart sank. "Mom, wait," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "He helps me more than the tutors do." His small hands clenched into fists, his eyes pleading, "Please don't make him stop." But Victoria's pride drowned out the tremor in her son's voice. "Enough, Ethan," she snapped, her tone final. "You are not to speak to him again. Do you understand?" Ethan bit his lips so hard it almost bled, but he didn't dare answer. That night, their penthouse felt colder than ever. Ethan sat on his bed, sketchbook untouched, his chest heavy with grief. For the first time, he found the courage to speak against his mother. "He's the only one who believes in me," he whispered angrily, tears streaming down his cheeks. Victoria stood stunned, her son's words cutting through her like a blade. But pride, again, won over tenderness. She turned away, leaving Ethan alone in his silence. Down in Queens, Daniel tried to push the moment from his mind as he tucked Lily into bed. But he couldn't forget Ethan's defeated eyes, the way he clutched his books like lifelines. Daniel knew the boy needed him, yet his place in the Miller world was fragile, unwelcome. Sometimes the hardest walls to break, he thought, aren't built of stone, they're built of pride. Still, he resolved quietly, if Ethan ever needed him, he wouldn't turn away. The following days were brutal for Ethan. Tutors returned, stricter than ever, drilling him with endless exercises. Victoria hovered, demanding progress, her frustration mounting with every stumble. Ethan's grades wavered, his confidence plummeted, and the joy Daniel had sparked began to fade. "You're wasting everyone's time," Victoria muttered after another failed session. The words echoed in Ethan's ears long into the night, convincing him that maybe she was right. But deep down, Ethan held on to a flicker of hope, one that no amount of scolding could extinguish. He remembered Daniel's calm voice, the way he turned math into stories, the way he said failure wasn't the end. That seed of belief, though buried under fear and shame, was still alive. And soon, in the most unexpected moment, it would push through the cracks and change everything, for him, for Victoria, and even for Daniel himself. Down in Queens, Daniel tried to push the moment from his mind as he tucked Lily into bed. But he couldn't forget Ethan's defeated eyes, the way he clutched his books like lifelines. Daniel knew the boy needed him, yet his place in the Miller world was fragile, unwelcome. Sometimes the hardest walls to break, he thought, aren't built of stone, they're built of pride. Still, he resolved quietly, if Ethan ever needed him, he wouldn't turn away. The following days were brutal for Ethan. Tutors returned, stricter than ever, drilling him with endless exercises. Victoria hovered, demanding progress, her frustration mounting with every stumble. Ethan's grades wavered, his confidence plummeted, and the joy Daniel had sparked began to fade. "You're wasting everyone's time," Victoria muttered after another failed session. The words echoed in Ethan's ears long into the night, convincing him that maybe she was right. But deep down, Ethan held on to a flicker of hope, one that no amount of scolding could extinguish. He remembered Daniel's calm voice, the way he turned math into stories, the way he said failure wasn't the end. That seed of belief, though buried under fear and shame, was still alive. And soon, in the most unexpected moment, it would push through the cracks and change everything, for him, for Victoria, and even for Daniel himself. The days grew heavier for Ethan, each one packed with stricter tutors and longer hours at his desk. Victoria pushed harder, convinced discipline would force results. "Again," she demanded as he stumbled through math problems, her tone clipped and cold. Ethan's small hands trembled as he erased mistakes until holes tore through the paper. The boy who once smiled in the lobby now sat hunched, his spirit shrinking. Each night, he went to bed with tears soaking his pillow. At school, the bullying only worsened. "Hey, rich kid, you gonna buy an A this time?" a classmate sneered in the hallway. Ethan kept walking, but his chest burned with shame. His attempts to improve were invisible to everyone but Daniel, and now even that lifeline had been cut off. When teachers handed back tests, Ethan barely had the courage to look. Another D, another F. Each mark felt like a nail in the coffin of his self-worth. One evening, Victoria paced the penthouse, frustration simmering. Ethan sat at the dining table, his books piled high around him. "You're not even trying," she snapped after another mistake. "Do you want to embarrass me forever?" Ethan's pencil slipped from his trembling fingers. His vision blurred, his breathing grew shallow, and before Victoria could say another word, he collapsed, falling from the chair with a thud. For the first time, silence in the Miller home wasn't chosen. It was terrifying. The ambulance ride blurred in Victoria's memory, her hands shaking as she clutched Ethan's limp hand. At the hospital, doctors rushed in and out, checking monitors, adjusting IVs. Hours later, a physician finally approached her. "Your son is physically healthy," he explained gently, "but he's under severe stress and exhaustion. He's 10 years old, Mrs. Miller. No child should carry this much pressure." The words struck Victoria harder than any business failure ever could. Sitting by Ethan's hospital bed, Victoria's heart cracked open. For the first time, she truly looked at him. Not as a Miller, not as an extension of her legacy, but as a fragile boy fighting to breathe under her expectations. His face was pale, his body small against the white sheets. She brushed his blonde hair from his forehead and whispered, "Oh, Ethan, what have I done to you?" Her voice trembled, foreign even to herself. When Ethan stirred awake, his first words shattered what little pride she had left. "Mom, please, let me see Mr. Carter." His voice was weak, but his eyes pleaded with a strength beyond his years. Victoria's throat tightened, tears she had buried for a decade spilling free. In that moment, all her defenses crumbled. She realized no amount of wealth or power could replace the one thing Ethan desperately needed: someone who truly believed in him. Swallowing her pride, Victoria made the call she never imagined she would. "Mr. Carter," she said softly when Daniel answered, "Ethan needs you." On the other end, Daniel's voice carried both surprise and steady warmth. "I'll be there." Within the hour, he walked into the hospital room, his presence bringing a calm that money could never buy. Ethan's face lit up for the first time in weeks. "I knew you'd come," he whispered, squeezing Daniel's hand. In that sterile hospital room, a new chapter quietly began. Daniel sat beside Ethan, gently guiding him through a puzzle book he had brought. Victoria stood back, watching with tear-streaked cheeks as her son laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. For the first time, she didn't feel anger or shame. She felt gratitude. And though she couldn't admit it aloud yet, she knew this janitor had done what she, with all her wealth, could not. He had given Ethan hope. The weeks after the hospital became a turning point in the Miller household. Victoria reluctantly allowed Daniel to spend time with Ethan, unsure at first, but too shaken to deny her son what he needed. Each afternoon, Daniel visited the penthouse after his shift, carrying simple tools: flashcards, notebooks, and his steady patience. Gone were the cold silences. Now, the living room echoed with the sound of pencil scratching and Daniel's calm explanations. Slowly, Ethan's spark returned. At first, progress was small. A homework sheet completed without tears, a quiz passed with a C instead of an F. But to Ethan, these victories felt monumental. He began walking taller, his eyes meeting the world with more courage. "Look, Mr. Carter," he would say proudly, holding up a page with fewer mistakes. Daniel always smiled, never exaggerating praise, but always steady. "That's progress, kid. Step by step, you're climbing higher." Ethan clung to those words like anchors. Victoria observed from a distance, struggling with mixed emotions. Part of her bristled at the idea that a janitor succeeded where experts had failed. But another part, deeper and quieter, began to soften as she watched her son laugh freely again. One evening, she sat across the room, listening to Daniel teach fractions with a story about splitting pizza. Ethan giggled, something she hadn't heard in so long it startled her. That sound pierced her heart more than any boardroom victory ever had. School reflected the changes. Ethan's teachers noticed he was more engaged, raising his hand in class, trying without fear. For the first time, a report card arrived that wasn't filled with failing marks. A B in reading, a C+ in math, and even an A in art. Ethan ran into the penthouse, waving the paper like a trophy. "Mom, look," he cried, eyes shining. Victoria took the card with trembling hands, her vision blurring as tears welled up. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," she whispered, words he had longed to hear. Daniel's influence stretched beyond academics. He taught Ethan about resilience, about how real strength wasn't avoiding failure, but rising each time you fell. "You see, kid," he said one evening as they walked through the park, "life's not about how much money you have. It's about what you do when things get hard. That's where character is built." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, the words sinking deeper than any lesson from school. For once, he believed he could be more than his mistakes. Victoria began to change too. She started coming home earlier, sitting quietly during Ethan's study sessions instead of retreating to her office. One night, after Daniel left, she lingered at the table with Ethan. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think success was everything. But I see now, I forgot what matters most." Ethan looked at her with cautious eyes, waiting. "I don't want to lose you, Ethan. Not to failure, not to pressure, not to myself." It was the closest she had ever come to an apology. As the months passed, Ethan blossomed. He joined a small art club at school, proudly sketching dragons and superheroes that once stayed hidden in his notebook. His confidence grew, and even classmates began to notice the change. "Hey, you're not so bad at math anymore," one joked lightly, and for the first time, Ethan laughed along instead of shrinking. Victoria attended his school assembly, clapping through tears as he received an award from Most Improved Student. Daniel watched quietly from the back, pride shining in his eyes. That night, back in the penthouse, Ethan hugged both his mother and Daniel tightly. "You're both my heroes," he whispered, his voice trembling with sincerity. Victoria met Daniel's eyes, and for once there was no distance between billionaire and janitor, only gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "You gave me back my son." Daniel shook his head gently. "He did the work. I just reminded him he could." The moment was simple, but it carried the weight of transformation, one that would last a lifetime. Life for the Millers never became perfect, but it became real. Ethan still had days when math was hard, still made mistakes, still stumbled. But now he no longer believed mistakes defined him. He had learned from Daniel that failure was only a chapter, not the ending. And with each stumble, he stood back up stronger, carrying resilience that no wealth could buy. Victoria also walked a new path. The cold, untouchable billionaire slowly softened, realizing her son didn't need a flawless image of success, he needed a mother who listened. She began showing up at school events, sitting by Ethan's side during art shows, even laughing with him over burnt pancakes on Sunday mornings. For the first time in years, their penthouse felt like a home. Warmth filled the silence where pressure once lived. Daniel continued his quiet work, pushing his mop through polished lobbies, unnoticed by most who passed him. But for Ethan, he would always be more than a janitor. He was the man who gave him courage when no one else did. Daniel never boasted about it, never saw himself as a savior. To him, he simply kept a promise to a boy who needed someone to believe in him. That humility made his role even more powerful. Lily, Daniel's daughter, grew close to Ethan as well. They studied together sometimes, laughing over silly flashcards, sharing stories about school. In that friendship, Ethan discovered something he'd been missing, the comfort of being seen simply as himself, not as a billionaire's son. Victoria often watched them from afar, struck by the simplicity of it all. Money had built walls around her life, but kindness was what tore them down. Months later, Ethan stood on stage at a school ceremony, holding a certificate for outstanding effort. The auditorium erupted with applause, his mother beaming in the front row, Daniel smiling proudly in the back. Ethan's eyes searched the crowd until he found both of them. For the first time, he didn't feel like a failure or a disappointment. He felt like someone worth cheering for, a boy who had fought, fallen, and risen again. That night, as the city lights glittered outside, Ethan sat at the dining table with his sketchbook open. He drew not a dragon, but a boy standing tall, holding a torch that lit the path forward. Victoria leaned over his shoulder, smiling softly. "What's that?" she asked. Ethan grinned shyly. "It's me, because I finally believe I can." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and for once she let them fall freely. In the end, the story wasn't about wealth or status. It was about resilience, belief, and the quiet power of ordinary people to change lives. Daniel reminded them all that success isn't measured in skyscrapers or bank accounts. It's measured in the courage to rise after falling, and the kindness to help someone else do the same. That truth would echo in Ethan's heart for the rest of his life. So, dear listener, remember this. Sometimes the greatest teachers aren't the ones with degrees or titles, but the ones who show up with patience, kindness, and faith in you. Ethan's journey proves that no one is too broken to rise again, and no one is too small to make a difference. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. And never forget, the brightest light often comes from the most unexpected places.